Hello, and welcome to Seismicity 3.0, Oklahoma and Earthquakes. My name is Michael Bricker, and I'll be your tour guide, your moderator through this 1-hour video CE presentation. In today's course, we examine the trends in seismicity in the state of Oklahoma, not to mention the ongoing changes, the evolution in the insurance coverage market, and our path forward for what is still today a significant economic exposure for property owners in the state of Oklahoma and the state generally itself. Next, let's examine the consequences, the outcomes that can occur as a result of an earthquake. Now, some of these consequences are quite likely in states like Oklahoma, while a couple of them, you'll be happy to know, are more than unlikely. Earthquakes in their entirety can trigger ground shaking, surface faulting, liquefaction, landslides, and of course indirect losses to property caused typically by the disruption of utility lines leading to fires, explosions, and water damage. So let's examine each of these consequences through a series of images, with each image having something to teach us about the uncertainty, the difficulties in loss adjusting, and ultimately the reason why I think it's prudent that fewer and fewer carriers are willing to offer a quality earthquake coverage in Oklahoma. Here you can see the image of a collapsed building. You can probably make out that it's a parking garage that collapsed following the Northridge earthquake in 1994. Still considered today to be one of the most costly, one of the most destructive earthquakes in U.S. history. Now, we may not be surprised to see that a building has collapsed as a result of a quake. However, let's remember that this building had been constructed with what was believed to be at the time a resistance to 7.0 and lesser earthquakes. The Northridge Quake was a 6.7 mag quake that struck, of course, in Northridge, a community not far from Los Angeles proper. And even at a 6.7 mag level, the building has collapsed. Our first takeaway lesson, that first, there is no, in any cost-effective manner, earthquake proofing any structure. And even those structures that are believed to be reasonably earthquake resistant, well, given a large enough earthquake, Mother Nature ultimately wins. Here we see imagery from the San Francisco Bay Area following the Loma Prieta quake of 1989, often referred to as the World Series earthquake, as this quake struck during the beginning moments of one of the World Series games that was being played in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. In fact, this quake struck at 5:04 p.m. on a weekday. When we look at this highway, we might wonder, where's all the commuter traffic? Well, it's estimated that as a result of the World Series not only being played in the San Francisco Bay Area when the Loma Prieta quake struck, but even more so that the World Series just happened to be played by two cross-the-bay teams, the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's. And as a result of two cross-the-bay teams playing in the World Series baseball game, well, most people had gone home early from work. They were at home watching the game. They were at the game watching the game, or they were at their favorite sports bar watching the game. And it's estimated that some tens of thousands of injuries and deaths were avoided just through the pure luck and happenstance of the World Series being played at this time. There's more to be gleaned from this message, from this image as well. We also must note that the distribution of damage around the epicenter in Loma Prieta was very unpredicted. Most of the direct damage to property was caused to public structures, especially the double-decker highways and bridges that traverse the entirety of the San Francisco Bay Area, while most of the private property losses to both residential and commercial buildings were caused indirectly by the quake in the form of fires, explosions, and water damage. This is our first example of the extreme unpredictability associated with earthquakes. Not only do we have no dependable technology to identify an earthquake in any meaningful span of time ahead of the quake itself, nor do we have any technology that helps us pinpoint where earthquakes might occur, but even when they occur, the distribution of damage around the epicenter is equally unpredictable. And as we know, the fundamentals of insurance tell us that unpredictability, especially when concerning a catastrophic risk exposure or peril, makes that peril increasingly uninsurable. And certainly we've seen that trend here in Oklahoma. Here we see imagery from the inside of an office building in Anchorage, Alaska, a 7.6 magnitude quake that struck in 2018. And this image provides us the opportunity to examine risk mitigation behaviors. What should we do if we're in a building and begin to feel those first tremors, the first signs that an earthquake is occurring, and what action should we take to minimize both damage to property and damage to ourselves, family members, or colleagues, not to mention the same recommendations we might make in advance to our clients. Historically, dating back decades, in fact, I was born in Northern California and spent much of my school years in earthquake drills. And back in the 1970s, we were taught, if an earthquake occurs, hide under your desk or a table. Unfortunately, the 1994 Northridge earthquake taught us that all that does is makes the bodies, both living and otherwise, more difficult to identify, to locate. Today, it's recommended, and in fact, let's take two scenarios. The first scenario, I'm in a single floor building, let's say it's my home. I begin to feel those first tremors. I must assume, remember, earthquakes will tend to occur in swarms in Oklahoma, so I must assume that the quakes are going to get worse from those initial tremors that I've now sensed. My first order of business is to make every attempt to exit the building, leave my home, and hopefully get out to an open area unencumbered by overhead tree branches and power lines, naturally taking family and other occupants of the home with me. The second recommendation is that as I exit the home, I should make every attempt to shut off utilities at the building connection, emergency shutoff valves for gas lines, breaker boxes for electricity, and water shutoff valves as well, attempting to minimize indirect losses to my home resulting from the earthquake and subsequent and likely disruption to utilities. In our second scenario, let's imagine I'm on the fourth floor of an office building, and once again, we begin to feel those tremors, that ground shaking. What should I do? Well, again, prudence dictates that I assume the quakes will only get worse from there and immediate action is warranted. I might find within that floor a reinforced area of the structure, under a doorway, or perhaps in the stairwell. In fact, the stairwell hopefully gives me the opportunity to travel down the stairs and hopefully seek an exit from the building. Furthermore, the building owner or managers should have designated in advance key employees who are trained to, once again, shut off those utility lines to the building, water, gas, and electricity especially, and for the same reason we saw earlier, to minimize the potential for indirect losses to the property resulting from fire, explosions, and water damage. So thank you very much for attending today's roughly 1-hour survey of Oklahoma and earthquakes. In today's program, we examined the earthquake as a geologic phenomenon, the movement of tectonic plates below our feet. We considered the personal experience wrought by an earthquake and some things we should be prepared to do during and following the quake to minimize our exposure to property losses and injuries. And further, we considered Oklahoma's evolving history as regards seismicity, categorizing our seismic history into the 3 eras I described. And finally, some hope for the future that we establish a non-traditional financing mechanism, very much like the California Earthquake Authority, to address the yawning economic gap that a catastrophic earthquake could create in our state. So thank you very much for attending today's program, and we hope to see you again virtually in another Bricker Insurance Education Video CE course. Thanks again, and have a great day.